Thank you to everybody for coming and sharing some ideas with you. I would like to start to first make two remarks. The first one, as Holly said, I'm no stranger to Melbourne. And coming back to Melbourne is always quite emotional for me because when we came here in 1994, Melbourne as a city and Australia as a country gave refuge to me. I was under quite severe attack by right-wing groups in South Africa, and I might not be alive today if it wasn't for the openness of this country to host people like myself. And for that, I will always be deeply grateful for what Australia has done. And I look at what's happening in the world around us today, and I cannot but think how proud I am for what Australia did for me in those years. Secondly, the last time I was here, my visit to Melbourne looked very similar. Came in the afternoon, although I did then go out to La Trobe and spoke there. Then we had an evening event like this, hosted by E&Y, with a lot of business people, and the next morning there was a business meeting here. So isn't it fantastic that tonight there's one change in the program? There's actually not me speaking to a group of business people, but a group of TI people. I think it's tremendous that you are on the move. And I'll say at the end again something about that. But it's fantastic where you are going. I think that you're at the takeoff after many years of good work, and I'll come back to that at the end. But it's fantastic what you have. So 3 sets of remarks. Firstly, a few things about TI. Secondly, a little bit how I see this, where our issue sits in the world, how it's historically got there, where we currently are, and also our strategy. And then lastly, a few words on Australia and TI Australia. So starting off with TI, operating now in over 100 countries around the world, with a business model that is a nightmare if you're a manager, because all of the chapters are locally registered, independent. That means that our AMMs are like mini UNs. It is something where I have no real power. I only have the power of persuasion. And half of the day that drives me insane in my job, because the passion of people in 100 different countries all believing that they have the right way means that you essentially have stalemates all of the time. If you add to that one of the fantastic diseases of civil society, namely that we fight more effectively with each other inside than what we deal with outside issues, it's the perfect storm. But the other side to that is that you can never fight corruption, particularly in politically challenging environments if you are a subsidiary of a headquarters sitting in Berlin. You have to be local, whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Zimbabwe, whether it is Turkey. You can name virtually every country in the world. You need to have that. So it's the balancing act there that brings the strength and the vibrancy into this movement. It's only in times when you think that we can do a lot more that it becomes a handicap, and I'll refer to that briefly when I come to the strategy. Essentially, TI does 3 things, and I think maybe I'd tell you the story how I came to this, although my apologies to people that heard me tell this earlier this morning in Canberra. So my mother and my father is 102 years old, they told me a few years ago that we're very proud of you. You know, when people come to visit and so forth, and then they ask, what do you do? And then we're not so sure. So my father said, well, I tell them that it's secret. We're not allowed to talk about it. And my mother said, no, I think it's like with the mafia and so forth, you know? You go there in Sicily, you kind of. And I then said to them, well, we do 3 things. We put political pressure at the top for change. And that's historically where TI has been absolutely fantastic. For changes in laws, policies, standards. Secondly, we help to fuel the demand for accountability, the more bottom-up. And that, I'll come back to in a moment, that's where the big game changes at the moment sits. And thirdly, we have a relatively few select programs in game-changing areas. And there TI Australia, as many of you might be aware, is at the brink of embarking on one of those and looking at the mining industry. So it's quite simple, actually, what we do. It's not as complicated. It's pressure at the top, fuel the demand, and then do some selected work of expertise. My mother and my father could remember that, and I thought if they can understand it, I can probably explain it to others as well. And but in doing that, what is the most challenging thing for us is actually how do we politically maneuver? Because ultimately our issue is one where if you are dogmatically about your principles, we'll get nowhere. Because essentially we don't fly with angels. We fly with everybody else that have their problems and their challenges. And if you put the bar too high, nobody will try to get over it. So you always have to put the bar just high enough so that you encourage the kind of best in class that they say they can get over. And it is truly a game where you continually move the goalposts. There is no such a thing that we have set the goalpost and that is the end goal. You set it and you continue reset it, because otherwise you cannot move this issue along. And I think that's often very difficult for people that are dogmatic about principles in terms of that it's all or nothing. This is not an all or nothing game. It is, and this is particularly true when you deal not only with governments and business, but also when you deal with other civil society organizations. Last comment on TI. I think our key strength in terms of our advocacy work is that we have a critical and constructive relationship with all stakeholders. And that is often quite difficult. Most NGOs pick one of the two. And they either the kind of in your face, and my good friend Kumi Naidu, fellow South African, we often laugh when people think Kumi is so outrageously in your face. And he says, well, but if he was working with TI, he would probably be milder than me. It's not about a principle that civil society has to be in your face or has to be just constructive. It depends on the issue. And also in dealing with issues, it is how you continuously adapt your strategy from sometimes being much more forceful, outspoken, and sometimes saying, how do you build it up? Ollie remarked that we just come from Malaysia. It was a fantastic egg dance there. I mean, I wouldn't have said it in the days I was there, but with the Prime Minister coming to open the conference and sitting behind the scenes and tell them that he would be absolutely foolish if he does that, and telling them what we're going to say if he arrives there, whether he's there or not. And at the same time, we had to safeguard our reputation, that of our chapter, and ensure a safe space for our chapter to operate when we leave. And the other part of the angle, try to strengthen a lot of people in the Malaysian Anti-Corruption Commission, in the government, who actually seek to do the right thing. And this kind of balancing act is not one where there's any room to be absolute about anything, because in any government, in any organization, no matter what problems they have people in there that seek to do the right thing. And it's about how you find that. And I think one should never look at organizations or governments as monolithic. And finding the champions and strengthening their roles, I think, is part of what we should seek at. Let me then move over, talk briefly about the kind of corruption world. Firstly, in historical context, and then more where we are now, and I want to spend more time where we are now. When TI started, we essentially started with saying we have to create a political will. And ditto, that was the main the main anti-corruption struggle of the early 1990s, was to create this political will. Not because I'm trying to show off how good TI is, but we then moved on to say, well, we need to create an international legal framework. And that is where the anti-corruption struggle around the world then moved. And that's how the United Nations Convention, the OECD Convention came in place, because there was a very strong realization that without that, fighting corruption at the local level was about impossible. The next wave, which again TI was leading on, was then creating both the national legal frameworks and national standards. That moved on later to become, by the mid-2000s, focus on enforcement, an issue that remains very, very strong there. And then towards the end of, say, around about 2008, 2009, TI started to move, and our 2015 strategy adopted in 2010 had a new focus, particularly on people's engagement, because this kind of bottom-up swell, where 10 years ago people said ordinary people don't care about corruption. It's not a sexy issue, and there's no person, I think, today that would still say that, because the evidence base in terms of ordinary people, how they care about corruption, is overwhelming today. And TI strategy then was much more, how do we also harness this? This is what I refer to as the demand bottom-up for accountability. That culminates in terms of where we're currently in, I think, in three things that I would briefly want to highlight. Firstly, that the external environment in which we operate today is one that dramatically favors our work. And I'll do it in three ways. Firstly, because we've got this bottom-up pressure. And you can use basically any unit of analysis that shows that ordinary people today across the world care massively about corruption. BBC every year does a worldwide poll, what are the most talked around issue around the world. Corruption for the last couple of years always come up either top or very close to the top. Avaz, with their 36 million online activists, asked them, what do you think is the biggest issue we should focus around? It's people from across the world. No surprise, the top three, but the sequence might surprise some people. Climate change, 3, human rights, 2, political corruption, number 1 issue. The UN's big data scraping for the Sustainable Development Goals, communities across the world, anti-corruption, governance issues, consistently in the top 4 of all issues. No other issue reaching that level of top priority for ordinary citizens. So you've got that, but we also have, and we will have, one can now confidently say on the 27th of September, a game-changing moment in the fight against corruption when in New York, the new Sustainable Development Goals will be achieved. And let me take a backdrop to this. When this UN process started, I think most of my peers in other organizations, civil society organizations, were very skeptical whether we're going to get anything really out of another kind of new Millennium Development Goals. So we came together 3 years ago, and 12 of us, after days of arguments, as is expected in civil society, we agreed on 6 principles that we wanted the new Sustainable Development Goals to have in common, and we went to see Ban Ki-moon with those. And we said that we will hold this whole process on those. And those were human rights. It had to have a strong focus on human rights, on sustainability, on accountability, participation, universality, and inequality. And what we got in the end with the Sustainable Development Goals is actually a package that includes those. And the game changer for us is not only that we will have a standalone goal, Goal 16, on good governance, access to justice, and open and accountable institutions. That is very important, and that's the one that we'll celebrate big time on the 28th of September. But the fact that we have a development paradigm shift, that you will no longer have the issue that accountability is a north-south issue. Accountability is about all of us. And I most definitely, if I learned one thing in my years at TI, is that this is not a north-south issue. It is an issue in terms of the interconnectedness and the weakness of, particularly also when you look in European institutions, the weaknesses in a global financial system that has devastating effects across the world. And that's why having strong chapters across the world is today more important than ever. And that's why, as Ollie said at the beginning, TI definitely started to think, well, this was essentially an issue, how do you clean up development in the way that it was then seen of corruption. And that has shifted very significantly to saying this is actually about how do you deal with corruption across the world. And it doesn't mean that you do it in the same way. In countries such as Australia, where you by and large have strong institutions with relatively worldwide comparable high standards of accountability, and so it is how do you further strengthen that, but also how do you tackle the fight against corruption in that context of institutions that are relatively strong, very different from tackling corruption in Sudan or Afghanistan, etc., where those institutions are by and large absent. And I think this, how do you deal with that and what you can learn from Australia, I'm going to come back to in a moment. Second one, and I'll speed up, that I think is an important trend when we look at TI fighting corruption, is that the nature of civil society is changing very rapidly around the world. I can proudly say that civil society can justably claim that it has been a major force of change in our lifetime. Daily when I'm in Berlin and I drive to the office, I'm reminded of the Berlin Wall coming down. Had a major impact across the world, including my own country, South Africa, where the ANC was unbanned, Mandela released, all within 2 months of the Berlin Wall coming down. Very simply because the Cold War was over with a stroke of a pen. The whole divides in Africa just disappeared in the way that you had the various military blocs set up against each other. And if you think about it, the fall of the Berlin Wall was brought about by civil action after decades of leaders, elected leaders, failures to actually deal with those problems. But those heydays of civil society, in my view, is over. I think that to live on how we've managed in the past, I think that with my peers in the international civil society, I'm known as quite an optimist, but very critical about how many of the big NGOs of the world, the TIs, the Oxfams, the World Visions, the Plans, the Cares, Greenpeaces, the Amnesty will actually be there in 10 years' time. I think that very few will survive if we continue to do it the way we've been doing it. Because TI historically has this triangle: business, civil society, and government. And at some point it was heresy in TI to say that I think the days of that is over, because civil society now are new kinds of social movements that work on very different ways than what we grew up on. Notions of accountability, of participation is very different for a new generation of young people coming up. And the challenge for organized civil society is whether we can adapt to become part of those in many ways. And when I come to strategy in a moment, I'll talk a little bit more about that. It doesn't mean that I believe that organized civil society should say, well, our heydays are over, let the new ones take over. Absolutely not. We've seen with the Arab Spring that in the absence of strong organized civil society, political gains that can be made can be reversed very easily as well. So I think that organized civil society have an immense contribution to make in the future, because of the fact that we have a lot of political savvy, because we've got expertise, and because we've got highly motivated people that are driven to bring about that change. But if we don't adapt to a new environment, I think what happened to Kodak will happen to us. Kodak for many years said, well, you know, Kodak invented digital photography. And for many years said, well, you know, it's not really taking off. And then others started to work with it, and then they said, well, we're going to be clever. We'll open new markets. We'll go to China, and they're going to buy all the analog stuff. And the Chinese said, why should we buy this old technology? We're going to skip the analog phase, and it went to digital, and Kodak is history. And I think that for many of civil society organizations, their business models will not survive the next 5 to 10 years. The whole issues of where they get their money from, how they are acting as an intermediary between the public and the recipients. Similar to eBay. When eBay came out, people said, this is ridiculous. I'm not going to send my money to somebody I've never met, and they're going to send me something that I have no idea if it works. It's not going to work. They worked out a way to solve that problem. And I think that in the same way, a lot of business models of organized civil society movements will be so fundamentally challenged in the next few years that we'll see big changes. But furthermore, technologies are so rapidly changing that at the World Economic Forum, where I sit on the board there, I was surprised that a year ago, in work that they are doing, 16 out of 21 sectors saw technological changes in the next 5 to 10 years as the biggest challenge to their businesses, both in presenting new opportunities, but actually making their current business models in a way irrelevant in a very short period. And I naively thought the technological revolution has already happened, and I think it's still ahead of us. And that is what I think our ways of operating will be challenged. For TI, it brings much more opportunities if we can rapidly adapt to it, because for us, information technologies are not actually a way of just communicating and doing things more effectively, but it's actually a way to promote and have much more participatory accountability. And in the TI movement, a few years ago, we had 3-4 years ago, we had virtually no digital tools in any of our chapters. And last year, we started to look into it. And earlier this year, we realized, if you start to put it together, in more than 50 digital tools that have all been developed in the space of the last 2 to 3 years. This is going to take off, and I think it's going to change the ways that we operate very dramatically in the future. And it will have implications that if we don't, as part of our membership, get younger people in, we'll just not have the mindset to adapt quickly enough. So while I said at the beginning it's fantastic that you have so many people, there's no undermining that, but I think one should particularly think also how do you get young people involved, because they definitely bring new kind of ideas and new ways of how you can use these tools. Let me then say 2 things about our strategy and then conclude. So in Malaysia now we adopted a new strategy, essentially with 3 pillars. We try to bring much more focus in, because TI has not been totally cured over the years of a disease that would do too many things. So bring in more focus in, with the first focus area mostly on people and partners. And there it's not only building coalitions with other civil society organizations and with businesses, but also with this much more fluid relationships that you build with grassroots organizations. For many of our chapters, this was unthinkable even 2-3 years ago. It's very interesting to see how that reaching out is starting to happen. And I think that will challenge any chapter. I think a chapter that is busy to take off with new things like TI Australia, it will bring particular challenges. The second pillar of the strategy is prevention, enforcement, and justice. And there, not only in terms of what you do with prevention and how you build institutions and how you build partnerships, but also looking at the other side of it. Over the years, many people have indeed become quite cynical, say, well, we've done all of this building institutions, but individuals still get away with it. And the impunity there is something that really drives not only an anger, but also undermines a lot of anti-corruption efforts. When thinking of Malaysia, as long as you have a prime minister that doesn't declare a $700 million US dollar donation and gets away with it, all corruption efforts, all efforts to curb money laundering are immediately basically blocked in their tracks because of that. So the fact that you have such a high degree of impunity most definitely undermines it. That should not be seen that we have all our eggs in that basket. It is an important element of this. And the last pillar of this strategy, building a strong movement. And for me, building a strong movement is not only about how do we become sustainable, how we look after our resources, but particularly how we build the relevance of what we do. And I think there to continually rethink, why are we doing that? What do we want to achieve with it? Is this really the best for us to do? And if you ask me a blunt assessment of our own assessment of what is really the areas we should focus on and add value to, I think we've been quite poor at that. And I'm not talking about TI Australia as much as the international movement and chapters in large, because ultimately the fact that people tell us, and I have it every day across the world, most places where I go, people tell me, your organization is fantastic. We have such high respect for you. Great. And it actually frustrates me immensely, because when I ask them, why do you say that? it's basically for all the wrong reasons. I want people to say that because we actually change the world. Because I'm not there to run an organization like Pepsi Cola or Opel. I'm there in an organization that wants to change the world. And as long as we don't bring that about, I don't think there's much to be proud of. Of course, there's things that we say we've done this well, the way that you people have planned my trip here and all of that. You should be immensely proud of that. No, but that's not ultimately why we are there. We are there to change the world. And I'm going to end up on that one after I just briefly say something on TIA Australia. TIA Australia has been a fantastic partner to the movement. When I talked about how people, argue and fight internally, TIA Australia has been, by and large, one of the chapters that I would put, if we had an index of let's work together, you would be quite high on my list, because you are quite solution driven, and it was always the case. And I think that in an international movement, participation is not a skill that you learned in a business course, it's an art. You need to learn how to do that. TIA Australia has always been very good at that, and I think that that's fantastic. But if you face the reality, you now have a potential of quite an important national integrity study, which I think you should set the bar high in terms of where can you innovate with it, where can you drive learnings through to the movement, where can you bring new kind of solutions in. That's fantastic. You have a mining program that I think that makes everybody, I don't know if the excitement is more out of nervousness or anticipation, because it can be quite a big game changer. You've got these two things. You've got clearly an environment where, on the back of the G20 meeting, there's a political space for you, because Australia did very well in terms of what you pushed with beneficial ownership, more than what most people expected. You've got a kind of probably a 2 to 3 year time window that you will not have easily again. And there I think that you have good examples in the movement of chapters that were in a similar position to what you find yourself in now. Not really, the plane kind of is on the runway going fast, but it's not really in the takeoff. And I think it's whether you can hit the takeoff now. From one chapter, when I asked the ED what was the 3 things that they did, worth to share, it was very simple. Firstly, a board that was aspirational, that said, we no longer want to hear about the 20 reasons why we can't. Your job is actually to make it. And if you can't make it, then we'll have a different ED. And I think you need the aspiration from a board to say, we want this chapter to go somewhere. Secondly was a very clear separation of roles and responsibility between board and those in management. The ABC of good common sense in civil society, not always the practice. A board is there to provide strategic oversight and do strategic direction and do oversight. And management is there to run the place. And if you get this mix between the two, it's a disaster for everybody. And I think that, and thirdly, what that chapter did, it synchronized its own strategy with that of the global movement. And in that you benefit from the various things that in any case happen globally and tools that are developed, and you don't have to do them. I think that's very good. So I'm going to finish off with a story I told at the members meeting. When I got this job, I thought, if I can leave one day to say, good, we've pushed our issue over this hill where it's irreversible part of the global policy environment, then I'd say it's time to move. On the 27th of September, we're gonna go there. So I did, over the last months, quite often think, maybe it's time for me to go. Because, where's the next kind of thing that we're going to drive to? What ultimately drives me now is to say, well, we've put ourselves in a position where we can actually bring about this real change. Because we've got the groundswell up, we've got our issue is there, we've got the global policy framework. And with that, I could not but to think of a beautiful scene in a very colonial, romanticized movie called Out of Africa, where there's a beautiful, an incredible, beautiful love scene. Meryl Streep is married to Klaus Maria Brandauer, and he's sitting in the lounge in their home in Kenya, and she walks in the garden with Robert Redford. And a young Meryl Streep, a young Robert Redford, and he tells her that he fancies her. And you can see the husband sitting not far away. And Meryl Streep very beautifully says, sometimes when the gods want to punish you, they answer your prayers. For TI, that's where we are. And I think that is very exciting, and I hope that that is also going to give you energy, that we've actually reached a moment in terms of the global fight where we can bring about that change. Thank you very much.